Mailman sees stain on elderly woman's pants. What he finds inside makes him dial 911. Michael, a mailman with a kind face and a warm smile etched by years of friendly encounters, had been a fixture on his route for over 2 decades. His presence was as familiar and comforting as the sunrise to the residents of Elm Street and its surrounding avenues. He knew every house, every dog that barked a greeting from behind a picket fence, and every resident who eagerly awaited the daily delivery of letters, bills, and the occasional postcard from a faraway land. Michael took immense pride in his work, viewing it as more than just a job. He was a purveyor of connections, a weaver of community threads. He delivered not just mail, but smiles, greetings, and a listening ear to those who sought a moment of connection in their day. He was a keen observer, noticing the subtle changes in his neighborhood, the blooming of a new flower in Mrs. Johnson's window box, the freshly painted shutters on Mr. Thompson's house, the subtle slowing of Mr. Henderson's gait as he retrieved his newspaper from the porch. Among the many residents on his route, Michael held a special fondness for Mrs. Evelyn Peterson, an elderly widow who lived alone in a quaint little cottage at the end of Elm Street. Her house, with its blooming rose bushes and neatly trimmed lawn, was a reflection of her personality. Vibrant, cheerful, and meticulously maintained, Mrs. Peterson, with her silver hair always neatly coiffed, her twinkling blue eyes that sparkled with warmth, and her gentle demeanor, was a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Children would often stop to chat with her, captivated by her stories and her infectious laughter. Michael and Mrs. Peterson shared a unique bond, their daily interactions a highlight of his route. She would often greet him at the door with a warm smile and a freshly baked cookie, eager for a chat. She would share stories of her late husband, a renowned botanist who had instilled in her a love for gardening, her beloved cat, Whiskers, a mischievous feline who ruled the roost with an iron paw, and her memories of a life well lived. Michael, in turn, enjoyed her company, finding her stories and her kind heart a welcome respite from the daily grind. He would listen attentively, offering a sympathetic ear and a kind word, his presence a source of comfort and companionship in her quiet days. One crisp Tuesday morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the dewy lawns, Michael approached Mrs. Peterson's house, a stack of mail in hand. A sense of unease settled over him as he neared her usually vibrant cottage. The once meticulously maintained garden was overgrown with weeds, their unruly tendrils reaching towards the neglected flower beds. The curtains were drawn, casting the house in an unusual gloom, obscuring the cheerful glow that usually emanated from within. He rang the doorbell, its cheerful chime echoing through the silent house, but there was no answer. He knocked, his knuckles rapping against the weathered wood of the door, but the only response was an eerie silence that seemed to amplify his growing concern. He tried the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked, a stark contrast to Mrs. Peterson's usual meticulousness. He hesitated, a conflict brewing within him. He knew he shouldn't enter the house uninvited, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that his dear friend was in need of his help. With a growing sense of dread, Michael cautiously pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was unusually dark and quiet, the air thick with a strange, musty odor that spoke of neglect and stale air. He called out Mrs. Peterson's name, his voice echoing through the empty rooms, but there was no reply. He ventured further into the living room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of apprehension. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Mrs. Peterson was slumped on the sofa, her body awkwardly positioned, her eyes closed, her face pale and drawn. Her clothes were disheveled, her once neatly pressed blouse wrinkled and stained, her skirt askew. And then he saw them, dark stains on her pants that looked disturbingly like blood. Michael rushed to her side, his mind racing with fear and concern. His years of experience as a mailman and a keen observer of human nature telling him that something was terribly wrong. He knelt beside her, gently shaking her shoulder, his touch hesitant, afraid of causing further harm. "Mrs. Peterson, are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and concern. Mrs. Peterson stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. She looked at Michael with a dazed expression, her eyes clouded with confusion and pain. Her voice, usually so clear and vibrant, was weak and raspy, barely a whisper. "Michael? Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," Michael said, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. He was so relieved to see her alive, but the sight of her frail and vulnerable state filled him with a renewed sense of urgency. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Mrs. Peterson tried to sit up, but a grimace of pain contorted her face, and she fell back against the cushions with a soft moan. "I fell," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "I think I broke my hip." Michael's heart sank. He could see that Mrs. Peterson was in a bad way. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy to the touch. He gently helped her lie back down, adjusting the cushions to make her more comfortable, then quickly scanned the room for a phone. He found it on the coffee table, its cord tangled and frayed, a testament to the chaos that had befallen the usually orderly house. He picked it up, but the line was dead, the dial tone replaced by an ominous silence. Panic started to set in, a cold wave of fear washing over him. He was alone with an injured elderly woman, and he had no way to call for help. He looked around the room, desperate for a solution, his mind racing through possibilities. His eyes fell on the front door, ajar, a beacon of hope in the darkening room. An idea formed in his mind, a risky plan, but one he felt compelled to follow. Michael knew he couldn't leave Mrs. Peterson alone in her vulnerable state, but he also knew that every minute counted, that he needed to get help quickly. He made a decision that went against his instincts, his training, and his usual cautious nature. He told Mrs. Peterson, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands, that he would be back soon, that he wouldn't be gone long. Then, with a final reassuring glance at his friend, he rushed out of the house, leaving the door slightly ajar to mark his hasty exit. He sprinted down the street, his mailbag bouncing against his hip, a familiar weight now a burden, in his desperate race against time. He ran past familiar houses, their neatly trimmed lawns and cheerful flower beds a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. He ran past Mrs. Johnson's house, her prize-winning roses a blur of color, past Mr. Thompson's house, his freshly painted shutters a fleeting image, past Mr. Henderson's house, his empty porch a silent testament to his neighbor's daily routine. He didn't stop running until he reached the nearest house, a modest bungalow with a bright yellow door. He pounded on the door, his knuckles rapping a frantic rhythm against the painted wood, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. A young woman, her face etched with surprise and a hint of annoyance, answered the door, her brow furrowed in question. Michael, breathless and frantic, his words tumbling over each other in his haste, explained the situation. He described Mrs. Peterson's fall, her injuries, the blood, the dead phone line, his growing fear for her well-being. The woman, her initial annoyance replaced by concern, listened intently, her eyes widening with alarm. Thankfully, she had a phone, a sleek, modern device that seemed a world away from the tangled cord and ominous silence of Mrs. Peterson's outdated model. Without hesitation, she dialed 911, her fingers flying across the screen, her voice calm and reassuring as she relayed the information to the emergency operator. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning air, their urgent call echoing through the streets. An ambulance, its lights flashing, its siren blaring, pulled up in front of Mrs. Peterson's house, its arrival a beacon of hope in the midst of Michael's growing despair. He led the paramedics into the living room, his footsteps now echoing with a sense of purpose, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The paramedics, their faces etched with professional concern, quickly assessed Mrs. Peterson's injuries, their practiced hands gently probing her frail body. They confirmed a broken hip, the pain evident in her whimpers, and noted signs of dehydration and malnutrition. Her skin pale and papery, her eyes sunken. As they carefully lifted Mrs. Peterson onto a stretcher, their movements efficient and gentle, Michael noticed a pile of unopened mail on the floor, its edges yellowed and curled. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the envelopes with a growing sense of unease. Bills, letters, even a birthday card from her niece, all unopened. Their contents a mystery, their silence a testament to Mrs. Peterson's isolation. It suddenly dawned on him that Mrs. Peterson had been neglecting herself for some time. The signs subtle but present, the clues hidden in plain sight. The overgrown garden, the drawn curtains, the unopened mail, they were all pieces of a puzzle that Michael had failed to assemble. His focus on his duties blinding him to the silent struggles of his elderly friend. A wave of guilt washed over him, a heavy weight settling in his stomach. He should have been more attentive, more concerned. He should have seen the signs, the subtle cries for help hidden beneath the surface of her cheerful demeanor. As the ambulance sped away, its siren fading into the distance, Michael stood on the sidewalk, his mailbag hanging limply at his side, his mind awhirl with a mix of emotions. Relief that Mrs. Peterson was finally getting the medical attention she desperately needed, guilt that he hadn't noticed her deteriorating condition sooner, and a newfound determination to do everything in his power to help her. He couldn't just walk away, couldn't just continue his route as if nothing had happened. He felt a sense of responsibility for Mrs. Peterson, a protectiveness that went beyond his usual duties as a mailman. He decided to stay at the hospital, a silent vigil in the sterile waiting room, until her niece arrived. He paced the floor, his anxiety growing with each passing hour, his mind replaying the events of the morning. The sight of Mrs. Peterson slumped on the sofa, her frail body a testament to her silent suffering. When Mrs. Peterson's niece, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a worried frown, finally arrived, Michael introduced himself, his voice filled with concern. He recounted the events of the morning, the discovery of her aunt's fall, the unopened mail, the signs of neglect. He offered his contact information, insisting she keep him updated on Mrs. Peterson's condition, his voice earnest, his desire to help genuine. The next day, Michael returned to Mrs. Peterson's house, his mailbag feeling lighter than usual, his mind heavy with thoughts of his elderly friend. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more, that his responsibility extended beyond delivering mail and providing updates to her niece. He felt a pull towards the neglected cottage, a sense of urgency to restore order to the chaos that had enveloped Mrs. Peterson's life. He started by cleaning up the house, his movements methodical and thorough. He washed the dishes piled high in the sink, their crusted food a testament to neglected meals. He gathered the scattered laundry, its musty scent filling the air, and loaded it into the washing machine, the rhythmic hum of the appliance a soothing counterpoint to the silence of the house. He tidied up the clutter, the stacks of newspapers, the unopened mail, the forgotten belongings, restoring a sense of order to the once meticulously maintained home. He then ventured into the garden, his hands itching to restore its former glory. He pulled weeds, their tenacious roots clinging to the soil, a metaphor for the neglect that had taken hold. He trimmed bushes, their overgrown branches obscuring the vibrant flowers beneath. He watered the wilting flowers, their drooping heads a reflection of Mrs. Peterson's own fading spirit. As he worked, he felt a sense of purpose, a connection to Mrs. Peterson through the shared love of gardening, a way to nurture her spirit while she was unable to do so herself. He continued to visit Mrs. Peterson in the hospital, his visits a welcome interruption to the sterile monotony of her hospital room. He brought her flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the pale walls and starched sheets. He brought her updates on her cat, Whiskers, his tales of the feline's antics bringing a smile to her face. He even brought her a stack of her unopened mail, helping her sort through bills and letters, his presence a comforting anchor in the sea of her worries. He learned that Mrs. Peterson had been struggling with depression and loneliness since her husband's death, the silence of the empty house amplifying her grief. He learned that she had been neglecting her own needs, her physical and emotional well-being fading in the shadow of her sorrow. He listened patiently, his heart aching for her pain, his resolve to help her growing stronger with each passing day. Michael's dedication to Mrs. Peterson didn't go unnoticed. The nurses, accustomed to the impersonal routine of hospital care, praised his kindness, his presence a breath of fresh air in the sterile environment. Mrs. Peterson's niece, her gratitude evident in her tear-filled eyes, expressed her appreciation for his support, his unwavering dedication to her aunt a source of comfort in her own time of worry. Even Mrs. Peterson, despite her pain and weakness, managed a weak smile and a heartfelt thank you for his unwavering care, her voice a whisper, her eyes filled with a gratitude that words could not express. News of Michael's actions spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, carried on the whispers of grateful residents and the admiring glances of passers-by. People started approaching him on his route, their faces filled with a mix of admiration and gratitude. They shared stories of their own experiences with elderly relatives, their struggles with loneliness and isolation, their appreciation for Michael's selfless act of kindness. Michael realized that Mrs. Peterson's situation was not unique. Many elderly people in the community were living alone, their lives hidden behind closed doors, their struggles masked by a facade of normalcy. They were struggling with daily tasks, their bodies weakened by age, their minds clouded by loneliness. They were lacking social interaction, their voices silenced by isolation, their spirits fading in the absence of human connection. He felt a growing sense of responsibility to do more, to extend his care beyond Mrs. Peterson, to become a beacon of hope for the forgotten members of his community. He knew he couldn't single-handedly solve the problem of elderly isolation, but he could make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. He started by simply being more attentive on his route, his senses heightened, his awareness sharpened. He would take a few extra minutes to chat with elderly residents, his smile genuine, his interest sincere. He would ask about their day, their voices filling the silence of their lonely homes. He would listen to their stories, their memories a treasure trove of experiences, their wisdom a gift to be cherished. He would offer a helping hand whenever possible, carrying groceries, retrieving mail, fixing a loose step, his actions speaking louder than words. He would notice small details, the subtle signs of struggle that often went unnoticed. A flickering porch light, a signal of a faulty bulb or a fear of the dark, an overflowing mailbox, a sign of neglect or a forgotten chore, a missed garbage pickup, a testament to failing strength or a fading memory. He would offer assistance, his presence a reassurance, his actions a lifeline. In their isolated worlds, he also started organizing small gatherings for the elderly residents on his route. His backyard transformed into a haven of community and connection. He would invite them to his home, his wife Sarah joining in his efforts, her baking skills adding a touch of sweetness to the gatherings. They would sit on the patio, sipping tea and nibbling on cookies, their laughter filling the air, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared experiences. These gatherings, though simple, provided a much-needed opportunity for socialization and companionship. They were a chance to reconnect with old friends, to forge new bonds, to share stories and laughter, to break the silence of isolation and rediscover the joy of human connection. Michael's relationship with Mrs. Peterson deepened during her hospital stay and her subsequent recovery at a rehabilitation center. He visited her regularly, his presence a beacon of hope in the sterile environment, his visits a welcome interruption to the monotony of her recovery. He brought her news from the neighborhood, his stories painting a vivid picture of the familiar streets and its residents. He brought her updates on her cat, Whiskers, his tales of the feline's antics bringing a smile to her face, a reminder of the furry companion awaiting her return. He brought her cheerful conversation, his voice a soothing balm to her worries, his presence a comforting anchor in the sea of her anxieties. He listened patiently to her stories, his empathy growing with each shared memory. He learned about her life with her husband, their shared dreams of a life filled with adventure and discovery, their joys of raising a family and building a home, their sorrows of loss and grief. He learned about her passion for gardening, her green thumb a testament to her nurturing spirit, her love for the earth a reflection of her own grounded nature. He learned about her love for animals, her kindness extending beyond humans to encompass all creatures great and small. He discovered a kindred spirit in Mrs. Peterson, a woman who, despite her age and frailty, possessed a remarkable strength and resilience, her spirit shining through the cracks of her physical limitations. Mrs. Peterson, in turn, found comfort in Michael's presence, his visits a welcome break in the sterile and impersonal environment of the hospital and rehabilitation center. She appreciated his kindness, his genuine concern for her well-being radiating. From his warm smile and gentle touch, she cherished his cheerful demeanor, his stories of the outside world bringing a spark of life into her sterile surroundings. She valued his unwavering support, his presence a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of her anxieties. She shared her fears and anxieties with him, her voice trembling with vulnerability. She spoke of her worries about the future, the uncertainty of her recovery, the fear of returning to an empty house filled with silent memories. She confessed her loneliness, the heavy silence that had enveloped her since her husband's passing, the absence of his laughter and companionship weighing heavily on her heart. Michael listened without judgment, his empathy deepening with each shared fear, each whispered anxiety. He offered words of encouragement and support, his voice a steady reassurance in the midst of her turmoil. He reassured her that she was not alone, that he would be there for her, that she was valued and loved, his words a lifeline in the sea of her loneliness. Their bond grew stronger with each visit, a bond forged in compassion, empathy, and shared humanity. They found solace in each other's company, their conversations a refuge from the storms of life. A friendship blossomed in the midst of adversity, its roots deepening with each shared story, each exchanged laugh, each moment of genuine connection. After several weeks of rehabilitation, Mrs. Peterson was finally deemed well enough to return home, her body regaining its strength, her spirit lifted by the prospect of returning to familiar surroundings. Michael was there to greet her, his face beaming with joy, his heart filled with a sense of accomplishment and relief. He had spent the past few days preparing her house for her return, his meticulous care evident in every detail. He had cleaned the house from top to bottom, the air now fresh and inviting, the lingering scent of neglect replaced by the subtle fragrance of lemon cleaner. He had tidied up, the clutter banished, the belongings neatly arranged, the house restored to its former glory. He had stocked the pantry with groceries, the shelves filled with healthy and nutritious food, a promise of nourishing meals and renewed strength. He helped her settle in, his gentle touch guiding her frail steps, his careful movements ensuring her comfort. He made sure she was comfortably settled in her favorite armchair, a soft blanket draped over her legs, a cup of steaming tea warming her hands. He then brought in her beloved cat, Whiskers, his furry companion held gently in his arms. The cat, sensing his mistress's return, purred with delight, his affectionate rubs against her legs a welcome greeting. Mrs. Peterson was overwhelmed with emotion, her eyes welling up with tears of gratitude and joy. She looked around her tidy house, its familiar comforts a balm to her weary soul. She gazed at her furry companion, his presence a comforting reminder of unconditional love. She looked at Michael's kind face, his genuine concern radiating from his warm smile, his presence a testament to the kindness of strangers. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice thick with gratitude, her words inadequate to express the depth of her appreciation. "You've done so much for me." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with warmth at her heartfelt gratitude. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Peterson," he replied, his voice sincere, his humility genuine. "I'm just glad you're home safe and sound." He stayed with her for a while, ensuring she was comfortable and had everything she needed. He made her a light lunch, the aroma of freshly made soup filling the air, a comforting scent of home and care. He then excused himself, promising to return the next day, his presence a reassuring constant in her newly regained independence. As he walked back to his mail truck, his footsteps lighter than they had been in weeks, he reflected on the events of the past few weeks. He had witnessed the fragility of life, the unexpected turns that could derail even the most well-ordered existence. He had seen the devastating effects of loneliness and isolation, the silent suffering that often went unnoticed. and he had experienced the profound impact of compassion and kindness, the transformative power of human connection. He realized that his actions, though seemingly small, had made a significant difference in Mrs. Peterson's life. He had been a friend, a caregiver, a lifeline in her time of need. He had helped her regain her strength, her independence, and her sense of hope. And in doing so, he had discovered a newfound purpose in his own life, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond his daily routine. Michael's dedication to Mrs. Peterson, however, started to affect his work. He was often late finishing his route, his mind preoccupied with Mrs. Peterson's needs, his thoughts drifting to her well-being, his internal clock ticking to the rhythm of her medication schedule and mealtimes. His supervisor, a stern man with a rigid adherence to schedules and regulations, noticed his distraction and issued a warning, his voice firm, his words a reminder of Michael's contractual obligations. Michael, torn between his duty and his compassion, found himself at a crossroads. He knew he couldn't abandon Mrs. Peterson, her vulnerability tugging at his heartstrings, her dependence on him a heavy weight on his shoulders. But he also knew he couldn't neglect his job, his livelihood, his responsibility to his family. He needed to find a balance, a way to reconcile his compassionate heart with his professional obligations. He confided in his wife, Sarah, about his dilemma, his voice heavy with worry, his brow furrowed with concern. Sarah, a kind and understanding woman, her heart as big as her smile, listened patiently, her eyes filled with empathy and support. She acknowledged his good intentions, his desire to help a woman in need, but reminded him of his responsibilities to his job and his family, the delicate balance that held their lives together. She suggested he find a solution that honored both his compassion and his obligations, perhaps enlisting the help of other neighbors or social services to assist Mrs. Peterson. She reminded him that he didn't have to carry the burden alone, that there were others who would be willing to help, that sharing the responsibility would not diminish his kindness but amplify its impact. Michael took his wife's advice to heart, her words a soothing balm to his troubled mind. He reached out to Mrs. Peterson's niece, suggesting they create a schedule for visiting and assisting her aunt, their combined efforts ensuring her well-being. He also contacted the local senior center, informing them of Mrs. Peterson's situation and inquiring about available services, his voice filled with hope and determination. He felt a sense of relief sharing the responsibility, the weight on his shoulders lightening, his mind easing. He knew that Mrs. Peterson would receive the care she needed, a network of support surrounding her, a community embracing her in her time of need. He continued to visit her regularly, his presence a source of comfort and companionship, but with a renewed focus on his mail route and his personal life, his steps lighter, his mind clearer, his heart filled with gratitude for the shared responsibility. The experience with Mrs. Peterson had a profound impact on Michael, his perspective shifting, his priorities realigning. It opened his eyes to the hidden struggles of the elderly in his community, the loneliness and isolation that often lurked beneath the surface of normalcy, the silent cries for help masked by a facade of independence. He realized that his role as a mailman extended beyond delivering mail. He was a vital link to the community, a source of connection and support, a lifeline for those who were often forgotten and overlooked. He became more attentive to the needs of the elderly residents on his route, his senses heightened, his awareness sharpened by his experience with Mrs. Peterson. He would take the time to chat, his smile genuine, his interest sincere, his presence a beacon of warmth in their often lonely days. He would offer assistance, his strong arms carrying groceries, his steady hands retrieving mail, his capable body fixing a loose step, his actions speaking volumes of his care and concern. He would report any concerns to family members or social services, his voice a gentle advocate for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He became a champion for the elderly, raising awareness about their needs, organizing community events, and encouraging others to get involved, his passion contagious, his dedication inspiring. He also started volunteering at the local senior center, his free time now dedicated to serving those who had enriched his life with their stories and wisdom. He organized activities, his creativity bringing laughter and joy to their days. He led outings, his enthusiasm contagious, his energy revitalizing. He simply spent time with the residents, his presence a comforting presence, his companionship a cherished gift. He found joy in their company, their stories a tapestry of life experiences, their wisdom a treasure trove of knowledge. He listened to their tales of love and loss, of triumphs and struggles, of a life lived fully, their voices filling the silence of his own past. He discovered a newfound purpose in his life, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond his daily routine. Michael's life had taken an unexpected turn, a detour from the familiar route of his daily routine. He had always been a kind and caring person, his warmth radiating through his smile, his compassion evident in his interactions with the residents on his route. But his encounter with Mrs. Peterson had awakened a deeper sense of compassion within him, a dormant wellspring of empathy now overflowing, its ripples extending beyond the boundaries of his mailbag and his daily deliveries. He had discovered a passion for helping others, a desire to make a difference in the lives of those in need, a calling that resonated with his soul. He found fulfillment in the small acts of kindness, the shared conversations, the helping hands that eased the burdens of others. He discovered a strength within himself, a resilience that allowed him to face the challenges of life with renewed determination and unwavering hope. He reflected on his initial hesitation to enter Mrs. Peterson's house, the internal conflict between his duty to respect her privacy and his growing concern for her well-being. He realized that his instincts had been right, that his concern for her had guided him to take action, even when it felt uncomfortable or risky. He had learned to trust his intuition, to listen to the whispers of his heart, to act on his compassion even when it meant stepping outside the boundaries of his comfort zone. He had learned the importance of observation, of paying attention to the subtle cues that often signaled a need for help. The overgrown garden, the drawn curtains, the unopened mail, they were all signs, silent cries for help that he had initially missed, his focus on his duties blinding him to the subtle struggles of his elderly friend. He had learned to see beyond the surface, to recognize the hidden needs, the unspoken anxieties, the silent cries for help that often went unnoticed in the hustle and bustle of daily life. He had learned the power of compassion, of reaching out to those in need, even when it meant going above and beyond his expected duties. He had learned that kindness was not bound by job descriptions or social obligations, that it was a universal language that transcended age, race, and social status. He had learned that a simple act of kindness, a listening ear, a helping hand, could make a world of difference in the life of another. He had also learned the importance of balance, of finding a way to help others without neglecting his own responsibilities. He had learned that compassion was not a finite resource, that it could be shared and multiplied, that it could empower others to take action, to create a ripple effect of kindness that extended far beyond his own reach. He had learned to rely on his support network, his wife, his family, and his community, to share the burden of care, to amplify the impact of his compassion, to create a web of support that enveloped those in need. He had learned that true fulfillment came not from fulfilling his duties, but from exceeding them, from going the extra mile, from extending his hand to those who needed it most. He had learned that compassion was not a weakness, but a strength, a superpower that could transform lives, including his own. Michael continued to deliver mail on his familiar route, his footsteps now carrying a newfound purpose, his mailbag a symbol of connection and care. He was no longer just a mailman, a deliverer of letters and bills. He was a caregiver, an advocate, a friend, a beacon of hope in his community. He was a reminder that kindness and compassion could make a world of difference, that small acts of caring could ripple outwards, touching countless lives and creating a more compassionate and connected world. The story of Michael and Mrs. Peterson is a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of community, and the transformative power of compassion. It is a reminder that we all have the potential to make a difference in the lives of others, even in the simplest of ways. A kind word, a helping hand, a listening ear, these small acts of caring can have a profound impact, creating ripples of kindness that extend far beyond our immediate reach. It is a story that celebrates the unsung heroes among us, the everyday people who go above and beyond to help those in need. It is a story that reminds us that heroism is not confined to grand gestures or extraordinary feats, but can be found in the quiet acts of compassion, the selfless dedication to the well-being of others. It is a story that inspires us to look beyond our own lives, to see the needs of those around us, to extend a helping hand, to be a source of comfort and support. It is a story that reminds us that we are all interconnected, that our actions have ripple effects, that our kindness can inspire others to act, to create a chain reaction of compassion that can transform our communities and our world. It is a story that encourages us to be more attentive, more compassionate, more engaged in our communities, to be the change we wish to see in the world. The story of Michael and Mrs. Peterson is a story of hope, a reminder that even in the midst of suffering and isolation, there is always the potential for connection, for kindness, for love. It is a story that reminds us that we are all capable of making a difference, that our actions, no matter how small, can have a profound impact on the lives of others. It is a story that inspires us to embrace our compassion, to extend our hands in kindness, to create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and cared for.